Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. This podcast is brought to you by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. Richard, I imagine given how much of a backlog we have, this episode will not be actually released until, I don't know, maybe late fall or early winter. But in fact, we're recording at the end of the summer. Such an interesting time of year for those of us who are academics. We've just kind of ended the true summer break part of the summer, which for academics who are expected to do research like us means the kind of less structured part where we were supposed to be doing lots of writing. And we're now turning our attention to our fall courses. I just want to capture your frame of mind at this particular moment. It's usually kind of a poignant moment, really, for an academic.
Yeah.
How are you doing as you look back on your summer and look forward to the fall?
Well, there are mixed feelings for sure. So I start teaching next week. So by this time, I had hoped that I would have maybe another paper or two written, which did not happen. We've talked about this, but we moved and I still have these very young kids. And I don't know, they do feel like excuses, but I just didn't quite have the time and energy. So I really did try to write a little bit each day, but I don't know. It didn't quite work out as I had hoped. I did a little bit of summer reading. As I mentioned, I read Lord of the Rings. I started reading Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, which is kind of a remarkable novel. You forget how amazing good writers are just at storytelling and the prose. Because, we read philosophy and a lot of his analysis and,
Kind of
it's
dry.
and pretty dry, yeah. But these like great writers of fiction, the way they write is just so marvelous. Just the words just kind of flow out of them with this rhythm. And at the same time, I was also reading a little bit of Cormac McCarthy. Have you ever read Cormac McCarthy? He writes these very dark, violent,
Right.
intriguing novels. Like he wrote No Country for Old Men, which became a
Yeah.
popular movie. I started reading his classic Blood Meridian, which was recommended. And again, just beautiful writing. I mean, he violates all these rules that, what's that, Strunk and White would say never to do. And you shouldn't write like that, of course, if you're like, in middle school. But the way he does it, it just works and it's just incredible. And I know I could never write like that, but it's just so beautiful. So I did get some joy out of some good reading, and I did a little bit of philosophy reading and a little bit of writing, but just nowhere near what I had hoped for. How about you, Justin? What's your feeling at this moment?
Yeah. Every single summer, at the end of the summer, I look back and realize I was not as productive as I meant to be. And yet I'm usually have two minds about it because when I look back on the summer, one of the things I'm sort of frustrated with was the fact that it was so unstructured and I start to miss the structure
Yeah.
so that I'm looking forward to teaching again, which does provide me with structure. There are certain days with set times and certain tasks that I absolutely must do during the regular semester. And I think I feel sort of thrive with that kind of structures under those circumstances. So I always look forward to having the structure again. So yeah, I've been working on my syllabus. I'm teaching a seminar on Mencius, and so it's the first time it's a new course. It's not like I'm just getting out the old playbook or anything. So that's very exciting for me.
Mhm.
I started out the summer, I have been saying since the very beginning, I've been saying since basically probably February of this year, that this summer I need to write 5 papers. I've promised 5 papers to various
Mhm.
people. I'm still working on paper number 3. And
Oh, that's still not bad. That's still a
well,
lot.
yeah, it means I'm just sending constant apologies to the 2 remaining people that I promised papers to. And actually, to paper number 3, I'm not finished paper number 3. That was due at the beginning of July, and now it's almost the end of August. So yeah, I'm running quite late. I consistently underestimate how long everything will take. I don't know what it is, but almost invariably, a paper will
Mhm.
take me something like 10 to 20 times as long as I expect. So I'm suffering in the usual ways, but also looking forward, feeling a little bit sanguine and optimistic in the usual ways too. I've become accustomed to these patterns now.
Don't you think there's a more broader general principle of psychology at work here where we always tend to underestimate how long something will take? It seems like it's not just papers, but just a lot of things.
Yeah.
It just seems like things take longer than you we're hoping for, or
Yeah.
it just seems like such a constant thing, like a pattern, as you put
Yes.
it. Yeah, I wonder if there's a term for this. I'm sure there's some kind of psychological term.
Yeah, that's right. I just speculatively, like, there are a number of concrete, specific tasks when you're sort of asked on the spur of the moment to think of all the things that you need to do in order to accomplish this task. You're probably only going to think of like 10% of them
Hmm.
because there's all kinds that just sort of somehow don't rise to the level of being noteworthy in your mind. So that's one way in which you underestimate.
Yeah.
I myself consistently underestimate how much rewriting I'll do. So I often, on a given day, I could spend all day rewriting 2 paragraphs, especially if I start in the afternoon. I find somehow that I'm more satisfied with my prose that I write in the morning during the kind of inspired. I'm a morning person. If
Hmm.
my morning writing tends to be, I don't know, somehow I'm more pleased with it. But anyway, so I underestimate that. But then also, I cannot in living memory remember when I wrote a paper with a structure that I actually stuck with. In other words, I've basically decided to restructure a paper from top to bottom several times, every single time I've written a paper. I've completely decided what I'm arguing, reconsidered what I'm arguing for, how I'm arguing for it. So yeah, I think that's the thing that really prevents me from finishing things in a timely manner is I just change my mind so much. And I'm very indecisive. Like to this day, I'm still not satisfied with anything I've written. A lot of people are different. They like once they're finished with the paper, they're like, ah, that's pretty good. Yeah, I think, and they kind of fall in line behind their own work. They like
Mm,
say, okay, before I was uncertain, but now that I've published, now that I put my name to this piece, I
mm,
really stand behind it. And that's
mhm,
actually not true for me.
mhm.
It's sort of like the published version of my paper is sort of the view that I just so happened to land on at the time that I absolutely could not delay or procrastinate any longer. So I think maybe for me, it's in part just that I'm second guessing myself a lot,
Mhm.
and I could do that endlessly.
Yeah, I hear you. Although when I read your papers, they seem so polished and it's so elegantly written, to be honest with you.
That's
Yeah.
nice.
So, and actually, we were just talking about that. My wife, Shuyen, because she's a scholar and we both really enjoy reading your work.
Oh, that's
Always
nice.
very clear and admirably clear and very insightful. Yeah. I guess I was also thinking like, yeah, just like packing or, I was supposed to go
Yeah.
buy some stuff like school supplies for my kids going to Target or whatever. And I thought, oh, this will take about 20 minutes, and then
Oh, I
it's
see.
it's like an hour goes by. And
Yeah.
yeah, it just seems such a constant thing that like so many different types of tasks just end up taking longer. And
Yeah.
I wonder if that's a common human experience. I suspect it is. And maybe you're exactly right that when we think of how long something will take, we just don't think of the whole, like all the parts that will go into that,
Yes.
into finishing that task. And we just go straight to maybe just like two components, and which are parts of it, but there's other things you need to do. There's other steps you need to take. So maybe that is
Yeah.
part of what goes on. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to give you a little bit of insight into my relationship, my spouse, Melanie, is very punctual. She's the kind of person who shows up for every event at least 5 minutes early. And then one of the things that she draws every single day, she's an artist, so she does these little hand drawings. And she's able to do that because she's always showing up early and then not having anything to do except usually often there's no one else there. Anyway, and I'm chronically late or kind of chronically last minute. Like I think many, many events where we agreed to meet separately at a place, where we've come by separate routes to the same place. She'll be there early and I'll show up 1 to 5 minutes late. And
Uh-huh.
she's taught me over the years that what I need to do is work backwards from the deadline. So think about, so what I tend to do is I think, okay, we're going to meet at this restaurant. It's a 10-minute drive. That means I can leave 10 minutes beforehand. And then she says, no, wait a minute. Think about all the
Right.
other steps. You have to
Yes.
walk to the car. Before
Parking.
that, you have to lock the door. You have to walk down from your apartment door to
Right.
the street. Before that, you have to put on your shoes. That takes you a long time.
Yes.
And those are the things that my mind skips over. I just think of the
Yes.
driving.
Yeah, that's right. Or if your body just got transported right into that car and just
Yeah, right.
and the car just took off right away and found parking immediately as soon as you got there, I guess it would work out. But there's so many other parts. And also things can happen. There can be a little bit of a traffic jam. There could be
Yes,
pedestrians on the
right.
road. You can hit bad lights. Yeah, I guess that's part of life. But are you good at not feeling frustrated? Let me ask you that. Have you gained enough wisdom and detachment, as we've talked about in this podcast, to be able
Yeah.
to not to get frustrated or irritated by these events?
Absolutely. I have the luxury of not being frustrated because I have good job security and thus the consequences of being late at various tasks are relatively small or minor compared to those consequences for most other people. But yeah, at the age of 50, I had a kind of roundabout with cancer. I've worried about dying and I'm already thinking about my future and such. So yeah, these little things seem relatively inconsequential. So I,
Hmm.
I am relatively detached. So
Hmm.
as we speak now at the end of the summer, I consider this a kind of poetically bittersweet time of the year where I can both regret that I didn't accomplish as much as I wanted to, and yet appreciate almost like philosophically in this other sense of philosophical, how this is very consistent with how summers have been for me every single year, all of my kind of adult professional life.
Yeah, that's right. But that's great though that you have enough insight and wisdom to be able to not be too caught up in these minor irritations or small setbacks because, right, in the grand scheme of things, first of all, they never go away, right? They happen every
Yeah,
summer. So if you already know that, then yeah, it seems unproductive to be so upset by them.
yeah,
Yeah, that's great. That's a great perspective, I think. All right. So I guess yeah, we should turn to today's topic. We do
yeah,
have a very special guest today, Professor Erin Cline, and we just had the conversation already actually, and it was I thought terrific and I think the
yeah,
listeners will greatly enjoy it and be enriched by this conversation, especially her great pedagogy and strategies for teaching. I think I learned a lot.
yeah,
Now, today's topic is women in the Analects and Confucianism, perhaps more broadly. Now, to many modern readers of the Analects, those who are reading in the 21st century, it is quite apparent that all of Confucius's disciples were men. So you might wonder in reading the Analects, is this an ethics built just for men? But in today's conversation, Professor Erin Cline addresses this timely issue and offers what we think is a persuasive case that actually the Analects offers an ethics for all humans. And we also focus on this really important passage in the Analects, focusing on a woman named Nanzi. Now, this passage has the only mention of a woman by name in all of the Analects, so it's a really important passage. And it's also remarkable in that Confucius's own disciple expresses unhappiness with one of Confucius's actions. In this case, his visit with a woman named Nanzi. So we're going to talk about that passage at length and why Professor Cline thinks it's been misunderstood and why understanding that it was misunderstood actually helps shed a lot of light into the nature of this important text. And so we're going to have that conversation in just a bit.
yeah, exactly. I'll just say, having had the conversation, there's sort of a number of interesting things about it. You can tell that Professor Klein is just very thoughtful about how she teaches the Analects of Confucius. She has this reinterpretation of the Nanzi passage that depicts Kongzi, Confucius, as much more open-minded about meeting with women who are actually in charge and ruling and making the important decisions for their people. And also, the third thing I wanted to mention about this discussion is that I think listeners will get a sense of how speculative ancient history it is. So the so-called received version of ancient history is really based on third, fourth, fifth-hand accounts that get circulated centuries after the fact when there aren't a lot of details, or available information, and then kind of get pieced together by later interpreters in their own distinctive way. So you'll get a sense of how difficult it is to reconstruct history and how sometimes that gives us license to imagine how the actual historical facts were misinterpreted or kind of deliberately reinterpreted so as to fit a particular narrative. So there's a lot that I think people will like about this, both having to do with women and gender in early Confucianism and also how history gets reinterpreted and by later people in the tradition.
Yes.
So thanks, Richard, and we will now cue the intermission music and talk with you again shortly. And we are back. As mentioned, we have a very special guest today, and it's Professor Erin Cline. We officially brought her in to discuss women in the Analects, but I feel like I can't pass up this opportunity to talk to Erin about just teaching the Analects in general, because this is something that she has thought about and really perfected and refined as a kind of craft in a way that I never have. I've just always admired her from afar for teaching the Analects as a kind of living text. But I guess I'm getting a little derailed. We should give our proper introduction to Erin first, and Richard was going to do that.
Yeah, Erin, it's a real pleasure to have you here. So Professor Erin Cline, I should say, is the Paul J. and Chandler M. Tagliabue Distinguished Professor in Interfaith Studies and Dialogue at Georgetown University, where she is also a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center. She's the author of numerous books, including The Analects, a Guide, published with Oxford University Press in 2021, as well as numerous articles, which I have learned much from, for example, Confucius on justice. And she has a forthcoming new translation of the Analects, which we will talk about shortly. All right, so Erin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to join you guys.
Yeah, we're delighted. Thank you, Erin. Yeah, so let me just start by admitting that I know that you've been teaching seminars on the Analects for a while now. And I take it that you're both the Analects, the guide that you published with Oxford University Press and your new translation are a product of teaching the Analects in your distinctive way. I thought maybe it would be useful for me as someone who hasn't thought so much about how to teach the Analects to sort of explain how I do it and then find out how you've improved upon that way. So here are like two things I can say about my way of teaching the Analects that I think are probably less than ideal. First of all, I do teach it as a philosophical text in some relatively conventional sense. So I end up calling attention to passages that seem to signal what Kongzi's positions are, his sort of official philosophical stances are on various issues, and then try to read it as a relatively coherent philosophical worldview. And that's to say, I don't do enough of something that I've always been tempted by, which is kind of just working on the character, sort of working on developing a portrait of Kongzi as a person, which is actually one of the more interesting and compelling ways of reading the Analects. But I just haven't, I guess maybe because I'm too much of a traditional philosopher or something, I haven't really taught it that way. So that's one thing I do that I suspect you do not. And then the other thing I know that I do sort of in a non-ideal way is I just follow the traditional sequence of passages. I highlight the ones that are considered to be most important. Anyway, so if you don't mind, tell us how you teach the Analects now that you've been doing it for many years.
Well, let me just start by saying that I love this text. I love teaching it. I love translating it, just reading it in the original. I love reading commentaries on the Analects. And so all of my work with this text in teaching and translation is out of a love for this text and really a belief that this is a text that stands the test of time. It has so much to offer us today, as it has offered people so many things over the course of thousands of years. And of course, the things that it offers us in some respects change, cultures change and evolve. And now this is a truly global text. It's available in many different languages. But I really think it speaks to so many fundamental dimensions of our experience as human beings, our experiences with families and friends and trying to live good lives and become good people. And so I think one of the things my students very consistently say is that they can tell how much I love the text when I teach it. And that helps to nurture enthusiasm in them.
I must say that when I first taught the Analects, I had a very difficult time, like the very first time I taught it. And I thought, wow, it's because I'm also trying to teach it as a philosophical text and trying to probe like interesting philosophical questions. And I realized it's hard because in the beginning, when you're not really as familiar with the various passages throughout the book, you can't call to mind all these other sort of corollary passages and kind of combine them to offer like a very rich picture of where Confucius, let's say, or his students stand on a certain topic and tease out some of the interesting implications. But after you teach it a few times and after you have really deep, rich conversations with students, it becomes this really amazing text to teach, especially. I actually enjoy, I would say, just like pretty much all of our guests have said, I enjoy reading the Zhuangzi a lot. Maybe that's my favorite text to read in some ways. But for teaching, I found the Analects to be maybe my favorite text because I actually, for some reason, end up having the richest, kind of the most intimate conversations with students, maybe because it touches on some really important, fundamental, challenging parts of the human experience. And somehow it brings to the surface these questions. Yeah, so I kind of have that similar experience as you, Erin, in teaching the text. It's just a marvelous text to teach.
When I first started teaching the Analects, I found that one of the biggest challenges for my students was to see sort of the coherence and unity of the text. They would tend to read it when I initially assigned it from start to finish. They would just see a whole bunch of fragments, right? A whole bunch of sort of little fortune cookie wisdom everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so I would struggle to teach them the unity and coherence and consistency in the text. And what I would do is have them look at, okay, let's look at all the passages on filial piety together. Okay, now look at all the passages on the Junzi together. And I started doing that. And then I started to experiment with actually assigning the Analects thematically. So that instead of reading, starting with book one, they would read, and I also experimented with the order of them reading different clusters of passages, right? What makes sense to introduce first and second and third, so that you're sort of providing these building blocks in terms of what the text is about. At the same time, I would teach two different classes, one where I would assign the Analects sequentially, and another where I would be assigning it thematically. And I found very consistently that when I assigned it thematically, students really understood the depth and importance of the text much more quickly and much more easily. So in my translation, this is one of the things that distinguishes my translation from other translations, is that I reorganize the text. I, include the traditional numbering so everybody can see where the passages are from and which ones they are, but I cluster them thematically, right? So there's a group of passages on harmony, filial piety, Ren, Junzi, Tien. And this, of course, will be really helpful to me as a teacher when it comes out, because I can just have my students read those sections of the translation rather than having to list in my syllabus all the different passages, right? Which takes up a lot of room in a syllabus. But it's my hope that it'll make the text more accessible to modern readers as well.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking from experience, you can offer them the guide that says, you've just read this very important passage on Yuan, the virtue that's often translated as benevolence or humaneness. You leave it untranslated for good reasons. But oftentimes what you do when you teach those passages is you remind them, there are these other passages that seem to bear on this question as well. Check those out. And I think that's almost just like a way of sort of signaling your kind of rhetorical commitment to maybe doing that someday, because the vast majority of students don't bother. I mean, they're just trying to get through the assignment. So I can see why it's more advantageous to actually teach those passages side by side. Yeah, it's great.
I am looking forward to this book a lot. I think that's just a marvelous way to teach it. And it's going to be great for all of us teachers to have all these passages that are addressing that specific topic, like Ren or Xiao, filial piety. Yeah, I think that's right. And also enriches, I think, the text in the way that, because sometimes you just get this one line and, you're like, what do you do with that? But when you have multiple passages, you can integrate them together, and then you just form a much more interesting picture of, what the text has to say about this particular important topic. Yeah, so that's going to be a really wonderful. And do you know when it's coming out, Erin, by the way?
Next year. I don't have a specific date.
Okay, next year. Great. I will be looking forward to that.
Yeah, so a lot of our listeners are probably listening to this episode months, maybe years after the fact. So that means you just have to look up Erin Cline. Last name is spelled Cline, and Analects, and you'll find the translation. So I'm just curious, Erin, you've mentioned in passing some of the topics around which the passages are clustered. One of them is Ren, more conventionally translated as humaneness or goodness or benevolence. Another one is the Junzi, which you leave untranslated, but others may recognize as the Chinese phrase, conventionally translated as gentleman or superior person, and Xiao, filial piety, and so on. It sounds like both your book and your way of teaching the Analects positions students to do is sort of understand as a relatively systematic view or theory what Kuangzi's views on a particular concept are. But do you feel like students walk away with a good impression of Kuangzi as a person? Is that something that, I'm sure that's something that motivates you to both read and teach the text. I guess I'm just saying I'm increasingly interested in this really interesting figure. I think that's one of the things that makes the Analects compelling to read, is that there's this really interesting, intriguing character who seems to be genuinely devoted to being a teacher. That's how the Chinese tradition is understood Kuangzi, Confucius, as kind of the first teacher, one of the great teachers. He seems genuinely to love his students, to love teaching. And he has a very interesting, hard to define kind of personality. So, for example, he's sort of fastidious about his rituals, and yet he seems like he's relatively relaxed and relatable, despite the fact that he's so adamant about performing traditional rituals in the traditional way and that kind of thing. Yeah, I guess I just want to sort of mark that as an interesting issue for me, is that Kuangzi, his personality itself, kind of comes through in the text in a way that a lot of other philosophical texts don't manage to
Yeah, and in my translation, in my teaching as well, I do include a cluster of passages that just are presenting him as a person. And there is in the Analects, there's this person who's at the center of the text, and he's complex, right? He's described and presented in reverential terms. And I think this is one of the ways in which we can see that this is clearly not just a philosophical text, but a religious text. He's referred to as the master. He's described. We don't just have his teachings in the text. We do have those, but there are lots of just descriptions of his conduct, the way that he behaved, the way he conducted himself, the way that he observed rituals and which rituals and in what way, right?
Yeah.
And so you have this person who's at the center of the text. I don't think that you have to read the passages as being conflicting, but I do think he's very human in that you see him at times express real faith in Tien, heaven. At other times, he's frustrated and he's struggling with his faith in Tien's plan, right? And things don't seem to make sense when his students get really sick and die young, right? He has real losses. So there's this very human side of him. At the same time, he is lifted up in reverential terms, and he clearly does have this sagely quality that leads his students to follow him and makes him this figure who's at the center and the core of this really important text.
And he's also not a stoical character either. He expresses emotion. He gets pissed off. You can see him getting frustrated, but sometimes he could be very gentle as well. And so you see this kind of like very broad spectrum of emotions. And I think that's kind of refreshing because he's clearly like a sage-like figure, but also you're right. He's a very human and complicated person. And he's full of different emotions. And he's a very intriguing, but also appealing historical figure as well.
It's one of the reasons that the text, I think, rings true, right? Because he's not just this God, right? Or this perfect person, right? There's real texture in who he is, his range of emotions, his experiences, his reactions to things.
Yeah, two things that stand out as making him relatably human. I mean, you've already mentioned some, but two other things are, first of all, he's sometimes a little bit sarcastic. He responds to people sarcastically, for example, when someone criticizes him for not sort of mastering the 5 traditional arts. And then also, he has a lot of professed modesty. I mean, there's a moment in which he suggests that Yan Hui, his star student, is actually better than him, maybe quicker than him at learning the way. There are times where he seems to suggest that he has to sort of look inside, engage in certain kind of self-examination to discover his own faults, that he makes mistakes, And the later tradition that I work on is pretty consistent in trying to interpret those professions of modesty away as being in some sense insincere. I mean, there's various degrees of insincerity, but nevertheless, they think basically it can't be true. He was a sage, he didn't have faults to discover in himself. And so they suggest that maybe he was just trying to deliberately position himself as a more relatable person so that he could inspire others. But I'm really tempted by the view that that's not actually so, that the historical Kongzi was aware of his faults and really did feel genuinely that he was still in the process of learning and still in the process of trying to discover and uproot his various weaknesses and vices and what have you. And that's, for me, one of the ways in which the text is also relatable. It seems like he's someone who's striving to be better.
Yeah, my students love that dimension of the text. I mean, first of all, they love that he has a sense of humor, right? They think there are some hilarious, and then there's some really funny moments in the Analects, right?
Yeah.
But they also, I think they recognize that he's presenting this sort of ethics of aspiration. He believes that we really can become better.
Yeah.
We should try to be better people. We can live better lives. But he's in the trenches with us, really working at that. He says, I'm not someone who was born knowing or with kind of natural talents or inclinations or gifts, but I really, really love learning and I work really hard at it, right? And that can be said of me. And so I think that makes him relatable and appealing because all of us feel like we are in the trenches, right? We're really working at it. Life is hard. It's a difficult process to try to become a better person, to try to respond to others with greater patience and empathy and gratitude.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think we've given our listeners some sense of what's distinctive about your translation and your approach to teaching the Analects is that you focus on themes and you also have sections that sort of give us a picture of Kongzi as a person. Another thing that you mention in the introduction to your translation is that you're taking some of the sexism and patriarchy, sort of, how do I put it, like some of the superfluous sexism and patriarchy out of the text. It's not like you're denying that those dimensions are there, but there have been some conventions in translating the text which sort of, you might say, crank up the sexism and patriarchy unnecessarily. So, for example, this other character, Ren, it's pronounced the same way as the virtue, just means person. But as long as people have been translating the Analects, some people have availed themselves of the convention of translating it as men or mankind back when that was supposed to stand in for humanity more generally. And so you don't make that mistake. But in a number of ways, you sort of remind readers of the ways in which our conventions for translating the text into English overstate the degree to which the text was meant just as a kind of guide for men, I don't know, aspiring to public service or something.
Yeah, I use gender inclusive language throughout my translation. And in many cases, that is more faithful to the original. You both know this because you both do quite a bit of translation work. And so, I mean, what translators have tended to do is just to render much of the text in gendered language where it's not gendered in classical Chinese. In some cases, one can argue it's implied. In other cases, I don't think that's a defensible view at all. But I'm trying to correct a lot of those inaccuracies. The passages about women, in many cases, have a slant. Some of them actually are not even actually passages about women. And so I'm trying to correct really some of the errors in previous translations. I'm attuned to those issues, of course, because I am a woman. I'm the first woman to translate the text in full in English. And I'm joining other translators who are women who are translating classical text. Emily Wilson has translated both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Also for Norton, my publisher. They didn't ask me to say that, but I'm a big admirer of Emily's work. And so, I mean, a part of what we're seeing is really the first generation of translators who are women working with classical texts. And I do think that we bring some distinctive insights just by virtue of our experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can speak with some authority as someone who works on the later tradition. The later Confucian tradition is in some ways more explicitly committed to patriarchy and sexism than I suspect the classical tradition was. So later on, as Confucians began to think more systematically about these issues, they developed a kind of, many of them, there are some famous exceptions, but many Confucians developed this kind of explicit commitment to the idea that their interest in social order and a certain sort of social harmony required hierarchical structures such that it's usually a male head of household and so on. And therefore, when they read and wrote commentaries on classical Confucian texts like the Analects, they worked very hard to read them very consistently as patriarchal in roughly the same way that they were. So it wouldn't surprise me if the later tradition overstated the patriarchy. And here I think it's worth bearing in mind that back in Kongzi's day, there were occasionally women in high office. You mentioned one of those passages, I think it's 820, that makes reference to someone's sort of team of ministers, which included a woman. And sometimes women were rulers. So it wouldn't have been quite as shocking in Kongzi's time as it was later in Confucian history.
Yeah. I mean, the story of women in Chinese history follows sort of just the opposite of what you would think, what you would expect. And my students are often shocked by this, right? In the earliest periods, you really find quite remarkable views of women. The idea that women can cultivate roughly the same set of virtues as men, as well as some virtues that men can't cultivate, like maternal rectitude, right? Like, so there are some distinctive virtues of women as well. But women are considered full-fledged moral agents, right? They can cultivate virtues. Texts that are dedicated to ritual outline rituals for women as well as men at all different ages, starting when you have young children, who are girls and boys, rituals for both. So women are not written out of those texts. This is such a contrast to someone like Aristotle, right? Who says, gives this beautiful account of the virtues, but says, none of this applies to women, right? Women can't be moral agents. They're incapable of cultivating these virtues. All of this applies to men. You just find such a contrast in early Confucianism. These thinkers really believed that women could cultivate themselves. So a big part of what I'm trying to preserve in the text is that view, which is very much characteristic of them in those early periods. And you're right, over time, and once you get into the commentaries, later Confucians take a really different view.
Right. Yeah. So while we're on this topic, maybe that's our opportunity to discuss our featured passage for the day, which is Analects 628. This is one that makes reference to a woman who seems to be influential. Nanzi is her name. And I should preface my reading by saying this. Many passages in the Analects just assume that the audience knows a little about the kind of historical, social context. And this is one of those passages. So if you don't have any help at all from, a commentator or a guide, you'll have no idea what's going on. So I'll just say it's about Kongzi meeting someone who's known to be a woman. And then, apparently what his disciple, Zilu, is not pleased that he's meeting with her. And then sort of in some ways, all the action takes place in trying to interpret his comments about the meeting. Because, it's very clear that Zilu's unhappy and that Kongzi is defending himself in some way. Why is he defending himself? Why is Zulu unhappy about it? So
And
I'll
this
read
is
the
the
passage.
only passage in the Analects that mentions a woman by name. And so that makes it
Yeah.
especially important to understand.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So women, they loom in the text, as you pointed out in your introduction to the translation. Mothers and fathers, I mean, oftentimes parents of both genders are mentioned together. The maternal figure looms in various ways, spouses. But this is the only case where someone's actually, a woman's mentioned by name, and her name is Nanzi, Nanzi. All right, so I'll read it. This is Analects 628, and this is Erin's translation. The master visited Nanzi. Zilu was unhappy about it. The master swore an oath to him, saying, if I have done anything wrong, may Tian repudiate me. All right, so there's some speculation about why Zulu is unhappy. Most people think, well, surely it's because he felt like it was somehow besmirching his own reputation, Confucius's, by visiting this woman. And that's where all the speculation begins. So there's sort of a traditional way of reading this passage. And then there's your way, right? Actually, multiple traditional ways.
And I think Zulu is a great place to begin, right? Because when I always tell my students, we always want to look at who Kongzi is talking with and who's saying what. Zulu, as a disciple throughout the Analects, is known for being headed, reckless, reactive. At one point, Kongzi says that he sometimes judges cases without hearing both sides. Kongzi predicts that he will meet an early death, and indeed, he dies in battle eventually. So Zilu flies off the handle here, and that's characteristic of him, right? Yeah. And so that's an important thing to note about the passage. Kongzi, in response, expresses some impatience with Zulu and is like, all right, let Tian, strike me down then, right? If I've really done anything wrong. Clearly disagreeing with Zulu in his assessment of the situation.
Yeah. Tian, by the way, is in other translations translated as heaven. So it is a kind of religious notion that he's invoking here. Yeah. That's
right. I mean, one of the things that really fascinates me about this passage, I started to work through this passage and I spent a lot of time on it in my book, The Analects, a Guide, talking about drilling down on it. I worked even further with it in my translation and uncovered a few new things about it. So I really have become really interested in this person. I came to believe the more that I began to explore Nanzi, her story, trying to understand the commentaries, the passages, I really became convinced that this is a case of a woman who's been slandered, who's been maligned, probably is a case of mistaken identity in terms of the way that she's been portrayed. And there were many elements of her presentation as an adulteress, which is what all the commentaries say she was, as an adulteress. Yeah. This is why Zulu doesn't want Kongzi to be associated with her. She's dishonorable. She's portrayed in this really, really negative light. Some of the commentators even say that maybe Kongzi had to meet with her because it was customary to meet with the wives of rulers when you visited their state. So maybe he just had to do it. So it's a matter of ritual propriety. And that's why he does it, because he always follows the rites, right? But the commentators all just go to great lengths to cast her in a negative light and to try to defend Kongzi as not doing anything wrong, right? The English translators of the Analects do her a terrible disservice, actually introducing new sort of scandalous elements into the story, which were falsehoods, made it more salacious, but which didn't have any basis in the Chinese tradition at all. So I'm trying to correct a lot of things. And I actually kind of think with the story of Nanzi, what I want to do is I want to talk about the cast of characters who are part of the story. It's confusing. Yeah. There are a lot of threads to the story. So I want to try to sketch this out. And I was thinking today, in some ways, her story kind of reminds me of, I think it really has all the intrigue of a Taylor Swift song or a cluster of Taylor Swift songs. So I don't know if you guys are Swifties or follow Taylor Swift's music at all, Richard, Justin?
My daughter, that's her favorite, musician. So I'm hearing lots of, to be honest with you, I really liked Taylor Swift 10 years ago. Yeah, or maybe it was 8 years ago. But then, I don't know, the new music doesn't hit me the same way. I like her older songs. So I don't know what's going on much anymore.
One of my nieces is a big fan. And if you don't have children, then your nieces and nephews become your ersatz kids. So in a way, I'm familiar with Taylor Swift by proxy. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I have daughters who are 9 and 13. We listen to Taylor Swift a lot. One of my closest friends always teases me that my career choice was between Chinese philosophy, country music, Chinese philosophy, right. Country music. And so I am a musician and songwriter. So I appreciate a lot of the storytelling that she does in her music. On the album Folklore, she has a cluster of 3 songs that tell the story of a love triangle from 3 different perspectives. So for Swifties, you're going to recognize that these are the songs Cardigan, August, and Betty. And you get sort of three different perspectives on one situation that unfolds between these three different people. And I love that sort of approach. I think that the Nanzi story would actually make a great series of songs of this sort, because you have a really interesting cast of characters who had really different perspectives on the situation, I think, who were sort of working with different complexities in their own stories, as best as we can tell from the Chinese tradition. One of the things that I love about this passage from the Analects is that it really reminds us that these were, at least the stories are based on real people, right? And human beings are complex, right? And the stories are complex. They're not one-dimensional. They're not simple. So Nanzi is the wife of Duke Ling of Wei. So we have Nanzi, we have her husband, the Duke. Another important character is a man named Song Chao. This is the man that she's accused of having had an affair with, although there really is no evidence that there was ever any relationship between the two of them. And so that's in question, but she was accused of having an affair with him, and so was regarded as an adulteress in relation to him. But there also is her son, who's a part of the story, named Kwai Kwai. And so you have this interesting cluster of different individuals, Nanzi and these three men who may or may not have been a part of her life. So let me start with her son. And then in some ways, this is, you can imagine the song that would tell his story. He was traveling and began to be taunted by some people in the state of song. They taunted him in sort of a rhymed verse, according to, I'm working with a cluster of early Chinese texts that tell different parts of Nanzi's story, okay? It's hard to tell exactly really what they were taunting him about, but he believed that they were saying that his mother had had an affair with this very famous and very good-looking man, Song Chao. And Kwai Kwai was embarrassed, horrified, and enraged. He believed his mother had done this, that she had been unfaithful to his father. He felt betrayed. He went back home and he made an attempt on her life. So Kwai Kwai tried to murder Nanzi. Nanzi recognized what was going on, went to Duke Ling, her husband, Kwai Kwai's father, told him what was happening. Duke Ling became very angry, as you would understand, with his son, and his son fled. His son left the kingdom in fear of his father and his rage. Okay, so you have this kind of odd turn of events there, right? So Kwai Kwai remains in exile over time. When Duke Ling dies, who takes the throne? It's not Kwai Kwai, it's his son, okay? Eventually, though, Kwai Kwai returns, reclaims the throne for himself, or claims the throne for himself for the first time, and succeeds in murdering Nanzi, his mother, okay?
Yeah.
Kwai Kwai is, by all accounts, a troubled young man, right? And behaves really viciously in the story. I want to talk for a minute about Duke Ling. So you imagine what would his Taylor Swift song be, right? Telling his story. Duke Ling, I think in many ways is the most interesting figure in this story. He's depicted in different ways and kind of scandalously as someone who's kind of out on the fringes, out on the edges, behavior-wise, in different texts. So the Zhuangzi says he would bathe in the tub with all of his wives, right? There are other texts, though, that record him being in same-sex relationships, which would make him one of the first gay men or LGBTQ persons in recorded Chinese history. Okay. In fact, Duke Ling and the story of him and one of his courtiers with whom he had a relationship, that story is the origin of a common Chinese phrase, yu tao, the bitten peach, which is a byword for male homosexuality in Chinese. So the stories about Duke Ling having been in same-sex relationships sort of had a ripple effect and were reasonably well known. Duke Ling was Nanzi's husband. Yeah. So that adds kind of a whole new layer to her story and whether or not she was having relationships with men other than her husband, right? And so it seems like a really, really important piece of the story to document.
Yes.
One of the early sources talking about Nanzi actually says that Duke Ling had invited this man, Song Chao, the guy that she's accused of being an adulteress with, that Duke Ling had invited him to his court in order to gratify Nanzi, right? Which doesn't make any sense unless you know that Duke Ling was a gay man or an LGBTQ person and cared about his wife, but wasn't intimate with her and wanted her to be happy, right? So there are a lot of potential sort of pieces of the story that make it complex. All of them, I think, point us away from condemning Nanzi. Another important piece, though, of Duke Ling's story is that he was not a good ruler. And different sources document this. The Analects itself actually says he was able to remain in power just because he had really capable ministers. We have other sources that suggest that Nanzi might have been involved in ruling. That would have made her especially a target of traditional commentators. That wouldn't have been welcomed. She wouldn't have been viewed in a favorable light if she were a woman assuming a position of power and trying to help with governing, especially with these later commentators writing about the text. It would have made people dislike her and be inclined to malign her. So that's sort of another, I think, important piece of the story. Some commentators do completely conflate Nanzi with the wife of another duke altogether. So there is genuinely, if you look at commentaries about Nanzi in these different texts, including the Analects, there is genuine confusion about who she's married to, what different people did, and there were some cases where she was linked to a different duke, and his wife actually had an affair with the renowned Song Chao, right? The very handsome Song Chao. So I think that gives us good reasons to question whether Nanzi was simply mistaken. And it would also help to explain, if that's the case, if it was mistaken identity, it would help to explain why Kongzi has a meeting with her, right? He doesn't think she's an adulteress, maybe, right? Maybe he's aware of that. Maybe he's aware that she's wrongly accused. In other passages in the Analects, he stands up for people who are wrongly accused of crimes. In one case, he even gives his daughter in marriage to a man who had been wrongly convicted of a crime and probably had been tattooed on the face, which meant that Kongzi was taking this person into his own family and saying, you know what? I don't care if everyone looks at him as guilty. I know he's not, and I'm going to receive him into my own family. So we know that Kongzi as a person is dedicated to sort of trying to right injustices and trying to interact with people based on who they really are and not just based on baseless, groundless gossip and accusations.
Yes, right. Yeah, in that case, wow, that's really interesting. So you're taking a story which for a long time has been interpreted as one where Kongzi meets with someone of ill repute, sort of someone who's known to be an adulteress or in some ways to be scandalous and have scandalous behavior. And most traditional commentators will say, oh, well, he had to do it because it was ritually proper for him to meet with the spouse of the ruler of the state. And that's why he's saying he's blameless, just because his hand was forced by ritual propriety. And you're instead suggesting that Kongzi is proving, as he's done elsewhere in the Analects, that he's calling the shots on the basis of his sort of assessment of someone's actual character and not their kind of public reputation or their sort of the superficial ways in which people are publicly judged. So one passage that Richard and I have talked about before is this famous one where he decides to marry one of his daughters to someone who has been sort of branded or in other ways deformed as a criminal and punished for committing a crime. And he thinks that in fact he didn't commit any such crime and therefore has no compunctions whatsoever about intermarrying with him, marrying his family, someone in his family to him. And so there Kongzi proves that he's willing to just cut right through all of the public censure and, the kind of the social condemnation and such that others might send in his direction and just assess someone's character on the basis of his own best judgment and what he thinks is their real virtue or lack thereof. And so you're reading it. This is yet another instance of Kongzi ignoring what people say, ignoring the kind of public reputation based on gossip and rumor and what have you, and making his own best judgment and deciding that Nanzi is someone that is well worth meeting. Yeah, really interesting. Did I sum that up correctly?
Yes, that was great. And I think we're required to use a little bit of an imagination to try to understand these stories, right? So you think about what would it be like to be a woman in ancient China who is married to a gay man, right?
Yeah, right.
What is that like? What does that life look like? And you try to help him rule, and he tries to give you the chance to have meaningful relationships of different kinds with other people, right? What does that look like? What are the complexities, right? I mean, we're at a point culturally where we're able to talk about LGBTQ people and see them and recognize them and their experiences. And I think here we see a story in the Analects where that's very much a part of her story and her family's story.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing you mentioned is that he does not seem to have had a reputation for being a particularly good ruler. And so you can imagine maybe it's speculative, but, imagine the situation. So he's gay. He's not really interested in having intimacy, kind of deep romantic feelings with women. And yet, clearly, he lives in a time where he has to marry someone of the opposite sex, gender, and have children. And moreover, he's not really interested in ruling. One imagines he's not good at ruling because he just doesn't care that much about it. That's my sort of hypothesis. And so quite naturally, she would be the one who would take charge. And maybe her heart is in it. And she does care about her subjects. She cares about how well the state is ruled and how much order there is and whether the people are provided for, against in years of famine and that kind of thing. And in those cases, you can imagine Kongzi would want to meet with the person who actually does the work of looking out for the people of the state of Wei. And so maybe that's why he thinks there's nothing to be faulted or blamed in meeting with her. He's meeting with the person who is in fact the ruler of the state of Wei. And moreover, someone who seems to have her heart in it, seems to actually be committed to ruling out of some care or concern for the people. Yeah. So yeah, that's quite a different interpretation.
Yeah. And a part of the tragedy is that one of our sources of information about Nanzi is a text called the Lian Yujuan, Collected Biographies of Women. It contains 125 stories about women's lives. So early Chinese texts, in many cases, document the lives of women, their stories. This is one of the first texts to do that. And there is a passage in that text that describes Duke Ling of Wei's wife as being intelligent and wise. But everyone has always said, that all the commentators on that text said, that can't be Nanzi because we know she was an adulteress.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But in light of all of this, it sort of makes you want to go back to that passage and say, what if that is the real Nanzi, right? Yeah. What if she was intelligent and wise?
So who else could it be? I mean, it's the same characters for the name Nanzi being used. Those aren't different characters, right? And we're talking about the Duke's wife.
That's right.
So they say that text was just mistaken in its assessment of Nanzi? Is that?
Yeah, or they say this must be a description of someone else, right? But you're right to say, who else could it be, right? And I think when we go through all of these sources together, you start to see the problems here. I mean, one of the things that captivated me about Nanzi's story is that it reminded me of the story of Mary Magdalene and the way in which she was maligned in the Christian tradition. I mean, Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus's disciples, right? And he did have women disciples. This gets sort of written out of the tradition at a certain point. She was a very important disciple of Jesus's. At a certain point in the tradition, quite late in the Christian tradition, Pope Gregory the Great conflates her with another woman from the Gospels, and people start saying that she was a prostitute. And this becomes a widespread view in the Christian tradition. It is baseless, right? It's a false claim that was made of her. Now historians are able to see that. But for centuries, everyone thought, she was a prostitute. In reality, she was a very smart woman who was a follower of Jesus, who probably supported his ministry financially. And it's taken a long time for the tradition to correct that. So Nanzi's story really started to remind me of what happened in the case of Mary Magdalene. And I think it, kind of gives us pause in terms of what kinds of views get passed along uncritically and perpetuated uncritically. And that's why it reminded me of the story of Nanzi.
So speaking of Nanzi, so I first came across Duke Ling because there's this, I remember in Paul Rauser, he has this textbook on learning literary Chinese. And one of the earlier stories that's put there is from the Han Feizi, and it includes Duke Ling. And he has this kind of affair with a courtier named Mizi Xia, and who takes the carriage without his permission, and then he takes one of his peaches and eats it. So at that time, when he first does that, the Duke Ling is or praises Mizi Xia, he's so wonderful. Look, he rides the carriage well, and he is so good at eating the peach. I forgot what he says, but he has this very positive view. But then the moral of the story is Mizi Xia's looks fade because he gets older. And then the Duke basically reinterprets those actions as just Mizi Xia is this terrible guy. He stole my peach. He took my carriage. So showing the kind of fickleness of Duke Ling. So I was also thinking that also, but although it's from the Han Feizi, so I guess that's quite a bit later, I would imagine. So I don't know if it's reliable, but already I guess at least Han Feizi did think Duke Ling had a kind of fickle or kind of a mercurial personality, perhaps, and he was kind of shallow in some sense. But you mentioned Song Chao. Is that just a different name of Mizi Xia? I was wondering if those are just two different stories.
Yeah, those are different stories. So Song Chao is the man that he was known for being very, very handsome. The Analects actually refers to his good looks, right? So
That's right.
Very, very good looking. Irresistible. So Song Chao is the man that Nanzi is accused of having an affair with. Mi Zixia would be the man that Duke Ling is linked to, and that becomes the source of this common Chinese byword for male homosexuality.
Yeah, the bitten peach, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, let me just say a little bit about, many of our listeners may not actually have done much or read much of ancient Chinese history, except for the stuff which is just sort of presented as uncontested fact. And so I just want to give people a sense of what it's like to do history, reconstruct the history of ancient China. It's extremely difficult. And as soon as you kind of hear how these accounts came about, you can see why we actually have quite a bit of license to reinterpret them. So imagine that you are trying to reconstruct what your little social group was like 100 years or 200 years hence. And imagine that there are no historical records for most of the people in your life, you know? And imagine that maybe some people happen to get interviewed for a newspaper article because, I don't know, they were rescued from a fire or what have you. Maybe some of these people were only mentioned by last name and you don't have their personal names. And by the way, there are lots of people with this last name, Johnson or Smith or what have you. And so then later, in some cases, hundreds of years later, people are trying to reconstruct what happened. And they only have a small cast of characters to work with. So one thing that happens quite often is they conflate them. You know, there's surnamed Song with a family named Song. And so they'll just decide that they're all the same person. Or, you know, only one spouse, one wife mentioned for Duke Ling of Wei. And so they just assume that's all the same spouse or what have you. Another thing that happens, though, is that people get attached to the most narratively compelling version of events. And this is why you can see why people might prefer the salacious depiction of Nanzi as a salacious person who's having lots of affairs and, you know, kind of like goes about gratifying her appetites with this handsome Song Chao. It's just something about human nature that we kind of prefer the version of events that seems most narratively interesting and compelling. And so people get rather attached to those versions. And then whenever they encounter conflicting accounts in the historical records, they err on the side of the salacious version. But oftentimes the salacious version just isn't very plausible when you think about how people are, you know. This is my long-winded way of kind of agreeing with Erin's speculation about what was actually going on in this passage. It just seems more plausible that, in fact, she was the better ruler and thus doing most of the hands-on rulership work, and thus Kongzi would have thought her the more appropriate person to meet, and also kind of more deserving of his attention because she seemed to actually care about the subjects. In light of what we can now see about Duke Ling of Wei, which is that he had lots of vices, we'll just put it that way. And either he wasn't that interested in ruling or he wasn't very good at it, and he seemed to be very self-indulgent.
Yeah, an important piece of his story, too, is that, I mean, I think you sort of think about from his perspective, again, imagining the song that might be written from his perspective. What is it like to be an LGBTQ man in that setting, under those circumstances, in that time, and then being looked back at by generations of Confucians, right?
Yes.
And in what way is that dimension of your identity going to lead people to view you as a slacker, as someone who only cares about the pleasures of the flesh, someone who's irresponsible, who's not dedicated to your family or the state or all the things you should be dedicated to. So I think there are reasonable questions to raise about the way that multiple characters in this story have been colored.
Yeah, so true. Right. I mean, even today, we hear some people that their standard interpretation of homosexuality is that it can't be one's natural romantic erotic inclination, that it has to have something to do with weakness of will or what have you. You're right. Yeah. Duke Ling may not have been such a person of appetites. And it may just be like this accumulation of stories, some of which may have been true of other rulers, and yet somehow became attributed to him because he was like the stock character for all these stories about uncontrolled appetites in this particular era. All right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a good time to wrap it up.
All right, Erin. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I learned a lot, and I think we're both so excited about this new translation. It is going to be marvelous for teaching. It's going to also have that right combination of, I believe, like historical kind of rootedness together with a kind of appeal to modern readers, which will be fantastic. Now, before we close, we ask all of our guests if there is one historical text that you would recommend. And we usually ask about a Chinese text, but perhaps we can be even broader. You might even recommend more than one. Yeah, what would that be if you can recommend any historical text?
I would recommend two old texts from different traditions. One of those texts would be the Tao Te Ching, the early Taoist classic. It describes the way in which we find our way home to a religious ultimate called the Tao that is often described in feminine terms, a kind of sacred, divine feminine entity, but how we find our way home to our original goodness, originally good sensibilities that we're born with. And I love that account. I find it deep and enriching. And the text of the Tao Te Ching is written to be a therapeutic text to help us find our way home wherever we are simply by reading the text, in addition to coming to understand the description of a good life that's being offered. The second text that I would recommend is the Gospel of Matthew. This is a text that's important to me. It's been important to me as a Christian. It tells us the story of Jesus through the telling of certain followers. But there's one part of the book of Matthew that I especially love, and that's the story of the three magi or kings and their visit to see Jesus as an infant. And the last line of that story, we are told those three kings, those three magi, went home by another way. So again, we're thinking about this theme of going home. And that line, of course, means geographically they took another route. They were trying to avoid the vicious King Herod, but they were also going home by a different way of the heart. They were changed by their experience. They became different people as a result of what they had witnessed. And that process of becoming better than we are and being transformed is central to all of these traditions. I think it's central to the Christian tradition, the Taoist tradition, and certainly to the Confucian tradition. And that's a big part of what we've been talking about and part of what I so love about the Analects.
Wow. Can I just say, I've never thought of that line. I just thought they were trying to escape death from King Herod. I never thought of it in that sense of they were transformed and sort of going home, having experienced this transformation of the heart. Wow, yeah. That's really quite profound. Yeah, thank you. That's really amazing.
This is what I love about ancient texts, right? There are layers upon layers of meanings that are woven into them.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah. Justin, you have the last word?
That was great. I appreciate the unconventional answer. I think it's great to link up our classical Chinese texts with other texts that have been formative in both establishing and shaping a tradition. Yeah, really fascinating. I think it just so happens I know that increasingly a lot of people say Matthew is their favorite of the Gospels. It's well worth recommending.
Oh, that's great. Hey, have either of you watched the show The Chosen?
Yes.
Amazing. Amazing. Justin,
only
are
the
you
first
familiar with
few
this?
seasons.
Okay, you've got to keep going, Richard. I know it's hard with kids, like to watch. There are like years that I'd watched no television at all, right?
Yeah,
so I totally relate to that. But if there's any way you can, I want to encourage you to keep going with it. And this is Justin, like, are you familiar with this show?
No,
I'm
not familiar with pop culture.
Beautifully done. It's a really very thoughtfully created and well-researched account of Jesus and his disciples and who they were and who they might have been, right? And there's a lot of imagining that's a part of that. But it's really just deeply grounded in the Gospels and it explores exactly what we've been talking about here, which is like, who were these people really? What might they have been, right? What were their lives like? What were their doubts and their struggles? And how did it all sort of play out as they're like traveling around together following this man, right? And it's beautifully, it's remarkably done.
That does sound very interesting. Yeah, it would be nice to see. For me, I don't know why, but it's very appealing. I've always loved historical fiction because I love to see how these sort of epic events actually do fold into a realistic account of the day-to-day interactions between people. So yeah, that does sound terrific. Well, on that note, we must thank Erin once again for a wonderful interview and discussion, and also for sharing so much of this inspirational, really, way of both reading and teaching the Analects and learning more about Confucius. So many thanks, Erin. And we'll say that was the way for today. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.